So, you've started writing your story. You're sure it's going to be the best thing ever put to paper. You get 30 pages down in the first few days, you're on fire. And then one day, you put off writing, and then you sit down the day after, and the words just don't come. You wait a few more days and try again, but the momentum is gone. Alas, rest in peace to that idea. But does it have to be this way? As someone who has been in that very situation plenty of times, I can firmly say that no, it doesn't. So today we're going to be talking about ways to help you stick with a story once you've started it and establish good habits for making sure you can get work done consistently. There's not much else to say in terms of an introduction, so let's get to it with method 1. Get a schedule. So this is the piece of advice you might be the most likely to hear in regards to writing consistently, but I think I have a few slightly different takes on the topic. That's because I see a lot of very black or white opinions on it. Either you must have an exact time of day where you must sit down and must write 10 pages or you're a failure and will never be a writer, or on the other hand, you have just write what you feel like it. Schedules are for nerds. And neither of these approaches, because trust me, I've tried both, are particularly great, especially not for everyone. My idea is to have what I'll call an aspirational schedule. That is to say, your schedule of writing as you'd like it to be, assuming life never gets in the way and you're feeling up to it. So rather than just drolly explaining this concept, I'll just explain the way I use it. I'm fairly busy between being a full-time college student and putting out one of these scripted YouTube videos every week. So there are plenty of days when, frankly, I just don't have the energy to write anything of enough quality that I won't just delete it later. However, I do have 2 days of the week, Monday and Tuesday, where I'm rarely doing anything extracurricular, so to speak, and so they are my dedicated writing days in the week. I get home from class, take care of any busy work that might need taking care of, and then I get in between 2 and 4 hours of writing on average on each of those days. However, if there are other times throughout the week that I feel up to it, I'll put in some writing then as well. But I don't give myself a quota in such cases. I just write while the muse is with me. So, while I've given myself a schedule, it's a bit flexible. I might end up writing every day in a week, but I don't have to, because I commit significant time on Mondays and Tuesdays regardless. Or I might rarely miss a Monday or a Tuesday, but I can then make up for it later in the week. Am I saying to do my exact approach? Not at all. What I'm saying is that I found a loose schedule that works really well for me. I encourage myself to do more than average, but am not having to pressure myself to work too hard on days where I just don't have it, because I know I can make up for it later. So, in your case, I'd experiment with times. Definitely give yourself some hard guidelines, but leave periods of time for writing outside of them. Doing this, you should find your happy medium before too long. And obviously, this all contributes to getting whatever you're writing finished, because a good schedule is the best way to ensure consistent progress. And consistent progress keeps you motivated, and being motivated helps you finish what you're writing. It's quite a healthy cycle. The next step in keeping yourself productive would be method 2. Keep notes. Now by this, I do not mean that you have to become a planner all of a sudden. This will work perfectly fine for the pantsers among you, those who just write things as they come to you. What I mean by saying keep notes is that at all times, or at least as often as you can help it, you should have something you can write your ideas down on. A notebook, a pen and paper, a notes app on your phone, it doesn't matter. I really emphasize this at all times thing as much as possible here, because I know there have been tons of times when I've thought of something interesting while I was away from my computer and thought to myself, yes, I'm sure I will remember to write that down. And I then proceeded to forget that thought within 5 minutes. This is a sort of twofold piece of advice when it comes to how to help you stick with writing. The first is that obviously if you're keeping track of most of the good ideas you end up having for your story, then you're going to be able to implement those interesting ideas a fair amount more thoroughly. The second is that if the inverse occurs, if you find yourself forgetting ideas fairly often, you might well be demoralized by the thought that the best ideas you had have been forgotten. You might say, "But J-Bat, I get all my good ideas in the shower or some other inconvenient place." And I would say there's a solution to that problem, mostly regardless of the situation. In the shower, get one of those clear waterproof pouches for your phone. Get ideas in class? Write it in the margins of your notes and transcribe it elsewhere later. Get ideas while driving. Set up a voice to text on your phone and keep that open. Just don't fiddle with it while you're actually driving. Alternatively, conscript your passenger, make them write your ideas down for you. Yes, some of these things might be inconvenient, but the inconvenience of doing any of this is going to tend to be a lot less than the inconvenience of forgetting the perfect conclusion to that one plot point that you just couldn't seem to put together beforehand. Ideally, you might want to have more than one medium for this sort of thing. My personal favorite is that in a Discord server I made for my friends, I made a little hidden channel that's just called Writing Notes, so that whether I'm on my phone or on my computer, I can just open up Discord, jot down my random thoughts into that little chat area, and refer to them later. Since I'm in that server all the time anyway, it's just really convenient. So find something like that for yourself. The easier you make it for yourself to take those notes, the more often you'll actually stick to it, the better notes you'll have, the more you'll do with them, the easier it becomes to stick with your story. However, the next method is a fair amount different from the previous two, yet just as important. That's because it is Method 3, establish a core theme. You might say,
But J-Bat, every story should already have a theme.
and yes, that's basically true. It's just that one of the reasons for that impacts you just as much as it'll impact any prospective reader. And that's because if you have a core theme, a core reason to be writing the story that you're writing, you will naturally find yourself more compelled to see that story through to its end. It is obviously possible to write a story essentially for its own sake, but if you have a drive to talk about something, anything really, that can become a theme, and you can tie that theme into the process of writing your story, and finding that motivation will become a little easier. This is especially the case because if the theme is something you yourself are struggling with, something even you aren't quite sure how you feel about, writing out the rest of your story is going to be one of the most effective ways of helping you resolve those feelings, and often such stories are aided by that internal conflict from the writer. It'd be a shorter list of great novels that weren't written by someone struggling with their theme than those that were. And it doesn't inherently matter how broad or specific this theme of yours is. It can be as broad as fate, or as specific as, how do I feel about this specific decision the local government of my town just made? If you believe that there's some significant insight to be made in exploring that concept or answering that question, it can work. Now, of course, it's not always as simple as, just establish your core theme, bro. And this is the sort of thing that might change over time, and I mean, considering what I was just talking about, that's almost the point. But the overall idea here is to figure out what exactly your reason is for wanting to write the story you're writing, and doing what you can to hone in on that reason and keep it fresh in your mind. An example of this whole concept could be something like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which is another one of those books I'll use literally any excuse to talk about. And it makes for a great example anyway, since the title is already a pretty solid indicator of what one of the book's themes is going to be. That of doing wrong, accepting guilt and punishment for that wrong act, and being redeemed for it so that you come out the other side a better person. Some themes are big enough that they'll saturate an author's entire body of work, and Dostoevsky is once again a great example, with faith and one's relationship with God and religion being something that a great many of his books focus on to a great extent, because it is one of the values he cared and thought about the most. The theme you center on for your writing doesn't have to be quite that big, so long as it provides you the direction and the drive to carry on. But after that, we have Method 4, re-exposure to inspiration. This is a bit of a tricky one and must be used cautiously. With that said, a great many of our stories may well be inspired by one or more specific things. A movie you watched, a book you read, a game you played, that struck you in a certain way and drove you to create a story of your own to hit on those themes. There's nothing wrong with this, especially since, as the old saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. We're all just finding slightly tweaked ways to tell the same old stories time and time again from new perspectives, and that really isn't a bad thing. For that reason, it can be super helpful to check back in on the sources of your inspiration, especially to engage with them more critically. You might be inspired to write something from the first viewing of a movie, for example, but upon multiple rewatches, you'll learn more from it. About the movie itself, the way the characters and the plot are constructed, and, most importantly, what ideas it expressed that you either want to expand upon or move away from in your own work. I say this method must be used cautiously because, if you aren't careful, you can end up creating a poor facsimile of the thing that inspired you, as opposed to something that uses it as a stepping stone. We all know this very well, as it is often the first of our writings that are extremely derivative of other media, with bad fanfictions being the most commonly known variety nowadays. The first full-length story I ever finished in early middle school was, essentially, a Star Wars fanfiction in which a totally not self-insert Jedi grew up alongside the clones on Kamino. Did this make any real sense in universe? No. Was it any good? I wrote it when I was 12, so that question kind of answers itself, but it was a valuable step on my writing journey. And depending on just how new you are, writing such fanfictions can be a useful exercise, and clearly, as evidenced by the longest work of English fiction being a Loud House fanfic, that genre sure can inspire people to keep writing, but I digress. At the end of the day, if you want what you're working on to be published in some format, you'll need to move away from the source of your inspiration in purposeful ways. I may have started my universe by basically mashing together what I liked about Warhammer Fantasy and Fire Emblem Three Houses, but it has, by necessity and through naturally changing as I improved as a writer, moved away from that. All this doesn't mean that revisiting this source of your inspiration and rediscovering what exactly you loved about it isn't a good idea, especially because you'll probably also find things that you don't love about it as much. These can all be extremely valuable to helping you figure out what you want your end product to really be like, and instill in you again those feelings that inspired you to create this story of yours in the first place. And then there's the last method, which isn't really a method, but is still important to talk about. Method 5. Accepting that some stories are stepping stones. In my time writing full-length stories, I've only actually finished 4 of them, even though I've started dozens. There are so many mostly mediocre ideas that have been left by the wayside, including one about a group of friends who get drafted into Vietnam, one about a hitman that I started suspiciously soon after watching the first 2 John Wick movies, and one inspired by the original Andrei Tarkovsky Stalker film. Of those I finished, there was that Star Wars fanfic, one about a soldier who fought in Stalingrad, one that was a little too close to being Metro 2033, and then significantly later, the first novel of the fantasy series I'm writing. Those of you who've been watching the channel for a while might be surprised that I didn't mention many fantasy stories in that list, and that's actually because it took me quite a while to get into fantasy as a genre whatsoever. For the longest time, I strongly preferred sci-fi and historical fiction, as my selections might indicate to some extent. And while I still have a soft spot for historical fiction, I'm not much of a sci-fi guy whatsoever anymore. Eventually, I read The Lord of the Rings, as all fantasy fans do, and played Total War Warhammer, and that helped me start warming up to the genre, and the ball started rolling. But the reason things turned out the way they did, and the reason I've gone on this long ramble about all these not very good stories I worked on, is because the last of the unfinished stories that I ever wrote, which I started in 2019 and called The Eye of the Gods, not knowing, of course, that there are already a half-dozen stories called that, would go on to lay the foundations for what I'm working on now. I only worked on that The Eye of the Gods story for about a month and a half, and reading a little back through it for the purposes of this video was unsurprisingly cringe and painful, but all the same, without it, I probably wouldn't have started on the series that has become the obsession of my writing career, even if it doesn't resemble that original in any meaningful way. The story itself was about a pirate captain who encountered a miracle messiah child set adrift and cast away by a trickster god. And now that I think about it, for some reason that only makes me imagine Megamind. That pirate captain, the extremely creatively named Captain Crimson, has gone on to show up every now and again in the tabletop RPG campaigns I run in my world, but that's pretty much it for his story. And though I never did and never will finish The Eye of the Gods, it was still a crucial step on my pathway to all sorts of things. To writing fantasy, or hell, even realizing I liked fantasy as much as I do now, and to all the things I'd go on later to do, including making a YouTube channel where I'm talking about it. While it was nowhere near the longest of the stories I wrote before my current series, nor did I work on it for a significant amount of time, it was still crucial. And that's my overall point here. At the end of the day, if you've tried all you might and you still aren't feeling it for a story, that's okay. There are infinite good ideas out there, and one that hits just right that you'll really want to finish will come to you. That doesn't mean you need to wait for everything to perfectly fall into place, just that eventually, after running through the steps of sustaining your story, you'll find it becomes easier and easier to come back to working on the same one. And once you do find that story, I'm not saying it'll take over your life as much as mine has. I was stupid enough to want to make a giant and probably too complex 5-part series, but all the same, it'll bring a passion into the life of your writing that'll make it all the more enjoyable. So don't stick to a story for its own sake if you come to the understanding that finishing it isn't the right call for you. And just to throw one more fun thing out there, a lot of these concepts apply to YouTube as well, if any of you ever wanted to start a channel. I mean, it's not like I've gotten anywhere particularly significant, but it's fun, and a lot of the same principles apply when it comes to maintaining this as well, so something to think on, I guess. But with that, I think we've basically covered how to stick with a story. There's no one right way to do it, but hopefully this has been helpful or at least provided you some ideas. Anyway, if you have any thoughts of your own about being consistent with your writing or something you'd like to share about your methods, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a really long way since we're still small here at JBats. And we also have a Discord if you'd like to hang out with my editor and I, as well as a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. Speaking of, I'd like to thank our patrons, starting with our Knights of the Inner Circle, Sani and Shadowrunner, our Knight Nico, and our loyal Squire, Greer. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, sit down and slam your head against the keyboard for long enough and you'll eventually either have a novel or brain damage. Just see which comes first.